This Geekster Media production starts now.
Greetings, geeks, and welcome to another installment of So You Want to Be a Geek. And this time, we're getting geeky about 3D printing.
Welcome to So You Want to Be a Geek, the podcast where we dive into the vibrant and ever-evolving world of geek culture. Whether you're a seasoned fan or just curious about what makes being a geek so special, join us as we explore everything from comics to movies, gaming, tech, sports, and everything in between. Each episode will bring you insights, interviews, and the latest news to fuel your passion and expand your horizons. So grab your favorite fandom and let's embark on this geeky adventure together. I'm Michael Canetti, and this is So You Want to Be a Geek.
We've got two awesome guests, and I'm calling this episode The Tale of Two Geeks, or The Tale of Two Petes, because ironically, they're both named Pete. My first guest is someone you might know if you've ever listened to Wizards the Podcast Guide to Comics or Box Office 30 with me, Peter Labrozzi, and his journey into 3D printing. My second guest is a former student of mine and avid technology enthusiast, creative, entrepreneur, and all-around super talented guy, Peter St. Amor, who's going to talk to us about 3D printing and his journey into it as well. You're going to find the parallels between these two extremely interesting. In addition to that, I am super excited, and one of the things that I've found with this podcast is the more I dive into these geeky hobbies and fascinations, the more I want to invest. And by the end of this episode, you too might want to be buying a 3D printer. And now, let's get geeky about 3D printing.
Hello and welcome to another installment of So You Want to Be a Geek, and this time we're geeking out about 3D printing. And I have with me today my forever co-host and compadre and everything, Pete Labrozzi, master 3D printer. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir. How's it going?
Good. So this show is a lot about talking about what people are geeky about and sort of redefining what geekiness means in 2024 and beyond. And there's been this sort of revolution in the world of 3D printing over the last, I would say 10 years, but probably it's even a little bit less than that, maybe even 5 or 6 years. And you have gone from photographer and content creator and video guy and 3D modeler to mad scientist. And I want to understand sort of the world of 3D printing and the different types of machines that exist and why it's so popular and why people are making businesses out of it and everything. So tell us a little bit of your chicken or the egg story of how you got into doing 3D printing.
All right. Well, I know this about me, but for the listener, I was always intending to be a photographer. A long time ago in a past life, I was intending to be an engineer. So that's kind of always been part of me from the time I was a little kid working with my Legos. I just to figure out how things worked, how to put things together. And unfortunately, I'm a little slow on math, so I don't think I'm going to be able to keep up with the big guys with the engineering thing. So I kind of decided at the 12th hour to go a different direction. But this has really been a renaissance for me in a way of being able to do some of this tinkering and being able to play around with some of this stuff in a more meaningful way than I would have been able to otherwise. To your point, I think the big change that's happened in the past years with 3D printing is it's just become so much more accessible. First time I touched the 3D printer was with you.
Yeah.
Mike and I were working together at a university for a minute, and they had a 3D printing space where they had a couple in there, and we were tinkering around and making little doodads, hair combs, stuff that was built into that or into Thingiverse. And I was like, wow, this is really cool. And I sort of put it in my back pocket because it was way out of affordability for your standard person at that point.
We had this small little Makerbot machine that was $3,000 and it took 8 hours to print the littlest tiny Statue of Liberty. I think was the first thing I ever printed. The
quality was really hit or miss. A lot of issues, and we'll get into this with the technical talk on it, but things stringing or just failures in the prints. And it's a bummer when you would come back to something after several hours and it's just it's just a big mess on the table. So
The spaghettifying of
Yes.
3D printing.
yes.
So that sort of sparked this curiosity, but also you were a 3D modeler and 3D animator in college, and this is almost an extension of that in a lot of ways.
No, it is. It's been another way for me to get back into that. I went. So Mike and I know each other from college. We met in college in the film program at FDU, and I was there intending to be a theatrical filmmaker. And over the course of the time, they would seed in little other elements of some of the other programs they had there, and some of it was graphic design and animation. And I found myself really loving it. It was something that I had tinkered with on my own, but again, just hadn't considered as any sort of career path or something. So because the two things sidled up nice next to each other, I was able to add a second major doing 3D graphic design and animation. And I just fell into it. I loved it. I think one of the things that appeals to me about it, plus then things 3D printing, is the precise nature of it. But when you're able to create a little doodad exactly the measurements, I want this to be 1 3/4 inches. And so you can just model it out to be exactly whatever you need it to fit to spec. And so I had a lot of fun with that. We were doing a lot of character animation, things like that. But for 3D printing, there's a billion people out there that are way, way more talented than I am that are making all these things all the time. I brought up, not the listener can see it, but hopefully on the YouTube side, we've got the little Iron Man here that's printed and painted with all the wondrous toys you see here sat next to me. But there's people that are out there that are making their whole living on just creating these models, and people me who are spending all the money from my career on buying all this stuff to make these things in my basement.
But the funny thing about that is you don't have to have been a modeler or a 3D animator to do this. There are portals, Thingiverse, where you can literally go in there and you download the file. I knew it was going to fall down.
Yeah, I was waiting for it. I shouldn't have touched them.
But you can go on Thingiverse.com and download these STL files with all kinds of different things that you want. Now, the interesting thing about 3D printing is people defaultly think of just the filament element of it, where it's just this stringy plastic material, but there are so many different things. The device you have behind you, or the multiple devices behind you, they are a liquid resin of some sort, or?
Yeah, so what I'd say is the two main consumer 3D printers that are out there in the world, the ones that people would be most familiar with, are what are called either FDM printing or SLA printing. FDM stands for fused deposition modeling, which is a fancy way of saying that it takes the filament that you showed. It's a thermoplastic, meaning it's a plastic that when you heat it up, it becomes pliable and it can be shaped into other shapes. And so if you go by the fused deposition, it's depositing the plastic and it's fusing it together, melting it together as it goes. So it goes layer by layer. It starts on the base and it builds a layer and it builds a layer and it just keeps building those layers up until you have your finished product. On the flip side, the machine that's in this lovely tented structure here behind me, there's two of them in there, is an SLA printer, which stands for stereolithography. And it's a really interesting way of printing. And it's something that was off my radar for a long time, because when most people think of 3D printing, they're thinking of the FDM type of print. SLA literally turns everything upside down. So you have a build plate that's suspended over a vat of liquid resin, and the plate dips down into the resin. And at the very bottom of the resin, on the bottom of it, is a LCD screen. Now, this has been changing a little bit over time and how they've been handling it, but kind of the current models have basically an LCD screen, what's similar in thought to what you would have for a television. And it has a number of pixels. The resolution has been getting bigger and bigger, as they have with TVs and everything. And it will either turn a pixel black or turn the pixel see-through. And there's UV lights underneath it. I know this one's way more complicated, but the array of UV lights will make the resin harden. So by opening up little spots in the black, otherwise black LCD space, it's exposing those little bits and areas to the UV light, which then hardens it. And the plate moves up a little bit, comes back down, sits on it again, and then it does another layer. So same thing, it's building layer by layer by layer, except it's doing it literally upside down.
Wow.
Yeah, so when I'm building something Iron Man here, now given he was done in a number of parts, but for example, I might do his arm in one print. So his arm is going to be, when it comes out of the printer, hanging from the bed. It's going to essentially have a bunch of little connective supports that are holding the arm in place to the bed, and then it's going to keep going down, down, down until it gets done with his little fingertips. So it's also another long process, but the difference, I would say the main difference between the two, and somebody would say, well, why do you go with one over the other? FDM printers are going to be the most accessible to your average user, but for me, I typically am building more rigid body type of parts. What do I mean by rigid body? If one of my projects recently is I've been working on a remote control car. So that's a really great spot to be building these large, essentially man-made pieces of things. If you're going with something more biological, a person, a statue, we've got Batman here, that's going to have a lot more of these soft and highly, highly detailed features. You're going to get a lot more range out of the SLA points.
I just noticed that it sounded different when you went closer. Like, ooh, I'm going to turn this. It's all good.
So it has benefits and negatives to both, is the other thing I would say too. FDM, again, much more accessible. You put a reel of plastic into your machine. You have to go, there's different software. We can get into this too. There's software that you have to use to what's called slice the files. You have a 3D model, but you need to tell the printer every one of those little layers needs to look this. So there's specialized slicing software that tells it how it has to approach each of those layers, where the nozzle has to travel to, or in some cases with a bed slinger, where the bed has to travel to meet the nozzle to put the plastic down. But they are very air friendly, especially over time. The plastics have gotten a lot better. You can breathe very easy next to an FDM printer. The SLA printers, because of the resin curing, it produces a lot of VOCs, volatile organic compounds, that you don't want to be breathing in. Hence this large tented thing that I've set up here. People come down here and they think I've got another hobby growing some specialized plants, but this is in a vein something that you would set up for this, just to keep those fumes in. And then the nice thing for me that worked out very well. The room that we're in, when we bought this house from an artist, and she had set this up as her art room. So she very nicely set up a little vent in the ceiling for me. So I've used the FDM printer to print nice pieces that I can attach to the ceiling, attach to venting, and then I've run vents up and out so fans pull all that air out and spit it outside where it's not bothering me and
So when you
giving me severe headaches.
Or find you passed out on the floor.
Yeah, but SLA requires a lot of work. I said, the FDM, you send it on its way. When it's done, it's done. When it's done printing on the SLA, you have a lot more work to do still. So like I said, it's all that liquid resin is still on it. You don't want to touch with your bare hands liquid resin. So you have to wear gloves for it, and you have to nitrile gloves to keep it from seeping in. I learned very quickly that you can't use your standard rubber glove because it's actually porous enough that material will actually get through and touch your skin and it causes allergic reactions. So nitrile gloves for those of you out there who are interested in trying SLA printing. So you pull it off the build plate, it's dripping with all this resin. That looks kind of Batman, or that looks kind of Spider-Man or whatever, because it's still very goopy. And so then you have to have 99% IPA alcohol to clean the pieces in. So you start going through, you have to be very mindful of it. You have a multi-stage, I usually set it all up out here on my table, system of you want to dip the initial piece in some kind of dirty resin water, because otherwise you go through your alcohol so quickly that it starts burning big time cash.
Right.
So you have kind of a vat of dirty-ish alcohol that's had resin dipped in it before. So you're going to do an initial kind of dip clean in that. Then you're going to pull it out. You're going to go to a more clean setting. You're going to dip it again in a more clean alcohol. Then you're going to sometimes have a spray bottle. You want to spritz it off, clean certain areas. And then ultimately, most of the time you'll get what's called they have curing wash stations, a 2-in-1 sort of thing where you need to, again, cure the resin later. But it also has a wash function where it will spin up the alcohol around the piece and you leave it for several minutes just letting this spin around it. Or they also now have these fantastic sonic cleaners that use pulses of sound waves essentially through the liquid medium.
I've seen that. Those are cool.
Yeah, and they do a lot better job in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people have been gravitating over to that, particularly because if you start thinking about the nature of how these things are going to come together, Batman here, I'll use as an example. I'll see if I can show the camera. He's got a big hole in the bottom of his base there. Now, not every model is going to have a hole that big, but the reason for that is if you think about this being attached upside down, he's all hollow on the inside. And you want to print a lot of your prints fairly hollow on the inside because otherwise, if you fill it with 100% material, you're burning material that you don't need to be. So
right.
it's a cost savings thing. It's a weight thing. If you print something completely solid, they get very heavy very quick. Mm-hmm. So he's completely hollow in the middle. But if you think about liquid, if this is upside down and gravity's working, it's going to be full of liquid.
Right.
So you have to also think about putting little drain holes in sort of intelligent spots, and then you have to fill those later. You have to get all that liquid out, which is what that sonic one is so great at doing. You can kind of put this in the sonic cleaner, and it's jostling it so much. Even if you've seen people do it's fantastic to watch on YouTube videos of people cleaning old jewelry or
old tools and getting all the rust off.
So I mean, it's kind of got that same satisfying thing where you can kind of see the liquid peels off and all of a sudden you get this nice clean model when you pull it back out. So once you get past all that cleaning stage, it's still tacky. You still need to be wearing your gloves at this point. So then you do what's additional curing. So like I said before, you have in the printer itself this array of UV lights below it. Now you need to put it in a cure station that has another array of UV lights, but this time you're putting it in there dry, and it's just going to bake in the final details of that model and just make it so it's nice and solid. It's not got any squish or anything left to it, and it's going to make it safe to touch and safe to handle, safe to spray and paint. I then eventually usually try to do with these things.
So when you're wondering why things are so expensive, the amount of work it takes to just get it prepped before they even paint it is extensive,
Exactly,
to say the least.
I mean, I wouldn't lie and say that even with the FDM printers it's gotten much, much cheaper over time. But a spool of 1 kilogram of the print material, probably on the cheapest end, you'll get for $14.
Yeah.
Then they have a lot of specialty materials. You're holding a boat that's made, this is a Benchy. Again, for the uninitiated, Benchies are probably the most 3D printed object in the world. This is kind of this stock little tugboat that somebody designed a while back, and it's small, and so it gives you a good benchmark, hence the Benchy name, on how your material is going to print, on how much time your printer needs to print something like this. And for example, with that Benchy, talking about the printer that Mike and I would have been printing that originally on, that might have taken 8 hours.
This would have taken at least 6 or 8 hours for sure for this little device.
My Bambu Lab printer, which Mike is sat next to, I can print a Benchy off in about 16 minutes.
Wow.
So it's really, really a huge difference in how, again, technology is gaining exponentially everywhere, but there's been so many leaps forward very recently with how these machines work, and then the price coming down on those machines. So you can meet in the middle and go, all right, I'm not going to kill my bank to be able to do this type of printing. Now, given there are things I've printed that have taken 2 days. It depends on how complex they are. It depends on this particular printer I use is a multi-material machine. So it has what's called an AMS on top of it that essentially automates changing of materials. Yeah. You can put up to 4 different colored spools or different material spools into it and have it change as it goes. So that can start taking a long time if you start building multi-material stuff.
Right. But even a little object which for those of you listening won't be able to see, but it's a tiny little tugboat essentially, it basically, the detail in it, even just the steering wheel on the boat and the different windows and how it sort of arches together is amazing. And to be able to do this in 16 minutes where not that long ago, 8 years ago, this would have taken hours for this little device object.
And that's why it's a good test. The Benchy tests for a lot of things that you need to consider when 3D printing. You'll see it has little bits of text, things like that. But if you look at the cabin on it is open. It's got 4 support structures, but then it's got a roof over that. So if you start to think in a 3D perspective about how something's going to print, and we'll just use the FDM printer for now, because again, it gets more complicated over on the SLA printer. if you have an object that's got a roof, and it's got 4 support columns, but the printer can't necessarily print in thin air.
Right.
So as soon as you go to do something, a roof, right? Or let's say, for example, you even wanted to make something an arch, something that goes up and down in kind of, or a square shape, right? It has to have something to build on top of. So that's even something that these printers have gotten so much better at these days, is being able to actually print, sometimes miraculously, in thin air, which I did a project for Mike. Mike, as probably any of the So You Want to Be a Geek fans might already know or soon find out, huge Batman fan. So he had sent to me a 3D model, as he's wont to do, and it goes, hey, look at this, which is usually a subtle hint. Hey, could you make this for me?
It wasn't even that. It was just, wow, this is really, really neat. And lo and behold, I show up at his house yesterday and he printed off this magnificent Dark Knight bat signal that lights up and everything. And I'll take pictures of it and I'll share it with the video portion of this podcast. But it was the detail alone, and I'll let you dive deeper into it, how it was able to suspend the bat signal in thin air is just crazy.
Yeah, so the way it built it is it built it upside down. So the bat symbol itself, at least, was stuck to the build plate when it started. But the problem then becomes, how do we keep that bat symbol floating in the middle? Now, you could just create a little panel through the middle and stick it to that, and that would be fine as well. But this is the type of print that I've been seeing pop up in the past couple of years, which has only, I think, to my knowledge, been possible in the past couple of years, with some of these printers being able to sort of make these magic little floating lines of filament without them drooping and creating a giant mess.
And the lines are, if you envision as thin as fishing line, that's what it is.
Yeah, so essentially they call these suspended prints, and it takes a little bit of special design to create them. And in this case, what it was using, a pretty simple print as far as materials went. A lot of black, a lot of black for Batman, but then the other filament that's used in it is basically a semi-see-through PLA. And PLA, I probably should have already mentioned, is probably the most common thermoplastic.
Yeah.
It's the one that most people are using.
Yeah.
There's a ton of other ones out there that have all sorts of different material purposes and reasons for using them. I'm not going to dive too deep down that rabbit hole, but suffice it to say, PLA is the basic standard that most people use for most printing.
Right.
So the see-through one, which again, they weren't even used to be making things like that, and the material science has come along so well with those that they're really cool.
Even we, back in the day, had a see-through or clear color, but it was really, when it was done, it was almost a yellowy. It wasn't translucent of any sort. It was just sort of a yellow or a muddy kind of whitish color in a way.
Yeah, and depending on how cheap a material you buy these days, you can still run into that. But a lot of them have gotten much better. And again, some of them are very hard to get clear. So I should say it's not easy to print something that looks like glass necessarily, but there's ways to play around with it, and it's getting better all the time. But it creates this mesh of strings that are essentially going from the edge of the circle of the bat symbol, and they're all intersecting with the bat symbol in the middle. So when the print is all done and you pull it off the bed, you've got this bat symbol that's just floating in the middle of this circular space, being held by all these very tiny pieces of string, which from far enough away, you might not even necessarily notice.
Right.
And then it also just had a really cool design as it went down, where it was using that see-through material to create these little arcs in the actual bat symbol's core itself. So not the bat symbol, but the big metal cylinder that's holding all together. So it also lights up in that. So it becomes just a fun little desk lamp.
No, it's pretty neat. The other thing I was thinking about is just, we were talking about the Iron Man over there, right? But there's also this element of, hey, now I got to paint this thing. And all of this, to me, is art in some capacity, one way or another. But the artistry and the patience of painting that statue just takes so much patience. And there's 6 or 7 coats of paint on that thing at least?
Yeah, I mean, he was complicated. I will say I'm at the beginning stages of my painting career. I've printed a bunch of things, and I'm starting to find my way through that. The wonderful thing, and you sort of mentioned this in the context of Thingiverse before, which I should say, Thingiverse was kind of the OG.
Yeah.
It's still around.
Yeah.
But now there's a million other wonderful sites that people are putting models up on, sometimes for free, sometimes paid. There's Patreons out there. for people that just all they do is create these high detail models.
You'll see guys on YouTube and they'll be, go to the link in my bio and you can buy whatever template it is.
Exactly. So Iron Man here is part of a multi-piece set. I've got the other part over here who is not painted and he's missing his head at the moment, but it's supposed to eventually have Iron Man and Tony Stark standing back to back on a giant arc reactor. But this is by a group called 3D Wicked, and they have their own Patreon, and I've subscribed to them for quite some time now. They make all wonderful Marvel related stuff.
Oh, wow.
And the stuff is super detailed. They really nail it. They get so many things right from the movies, from the comics. So it's a lot of fun, just as a little shout out for them to mess around with their stuff. But yeah, no, so to walk you through the putting Iron Man together A to Z, I did this all in the SLA printer. It was a number of different prints. I had to do the arms separately. I had to do the legs. Even the legs are in different pieces. They sort of have each thigh was done in one piece, and then the boot, if you will, was done in another. And then the middle section of his core, his helmet. They're all done in different little sections. It's printed in all these different pieces. So the first thing you got to do is put this all together. So different people have different methods that they for getting it together. Usually it involves some type of glue or epoxy. I use a variation on crazy glue. I use Gorilla Glue, but the gel kind. I found that that's worked very well for me in fitting this stuff together. And you have to do a little post-processing work sometimes. Sometimes you got to whip out a file or some sandpaper and kind of smooth edges. Even with these printers, they're getting better and better and better all the time at hiding what's called layer lines. So I mentioned already. Yeah, you can definitely see the layer lines on the FDM for sure. Because both of these processes are putting things down one layer at a time, even though the layers are getting down to micron size now, sometimes you can still make out some of those lines.
Right.
So sometimes you need to spend some time to buff those lines down, so it's not going to make your finished model look, it's a bunch of horizontal rows. A little bit of that with these prints can sometimes be saved by how you orient your model in printing. So how you position it can sometimes be a little bit helpful. But I spent a lot of time sanding this, making sure it was nice and smooth. And then sometimes you have to fill gaps. Because Iron Man's armor is very rigid and what I would describe as something being like biological, not smooth, somebody's skin or something like that. You can kind of get away with hiding a little bit more of that. You can go, oh, battle damage. It's got a little denser or whatever in it. So then the seams aren't as big a deal to do as something the Tony Stark, whose suit I'm going to have to seal a bunch of gaps on to mesh those different parts together. But once I got that all done, you have to start with a coat of primer. I do all of this with an airbrush. So you can kind of see in the video, I've got this whole airbrushing station over here. And actually everything you see here outside of the tools, but all the racks, everything that's holding it is all 3D printed. Every one of these pieces that's holding all this paint, this that's holding all these tools in it was all done over on the FDM printer. So that's why I say I build like a lot of really useful real world items with that. And then it comes in very handy here. So it's 3D printing everything down here. But I've got this little spray booth, so I would set him up in pieces in the spray booth once I got the majority of it together. So I did an initial layer on him that was, it's with good old Rust-Oleum, just this really bright, shiny metallic coating to lay down this really shiny base coat, because Iron Man has shiny armor. It's got to need that luster look to it. So putting that down as a base coat, and then, putting down the primer first, then putting down the base coat of the shiny. And then spending a lot of time with the airbrush, just doing different sections. Because he's so majority this kind of hot rod red, I had this little Tamiya paint that I was able to get. And you have to kind of learn how to airbrush too and mix the paints in just a certain way so they get kind of liquidy. And did multiple layers of that. I think I probably put 3 or 4 coats of that red layer down before I was happy with the saturation of how red it was over that silver. And then everything after that was hand painted. So all the gold, there's little spots that are white. It's much harder to see, but I also did some kind of line work with some blacks and grays just to kind of make a little more contrasty pops in certain areas. And then when all that was done, I did some washes. And washes are basically really watered down paints and inks, essentially, where you can kind of paint a little bit of that in and make it look a little bit, the metal's been used or it's got grease on it or something like that. And then finally, I just did some little spot highlights in very select places with a clear coat to sort of make things look they were shinier, his eyes.
But even the way just the light hits it, you could see how it's sort of the shadows and the reflections off of the light from just the light in the studio here. It just looks fantastic. But you got to remember, folks, this is a labor of love. This is not just, hey, I'm going to just print this thing and magically it's done. He is doing this with a great deal of passion and time to build this beautiful model.
You could get this model in one piece. You'd have to use a lot of support material. One of the things that the FDM and the SLA printer both do is create, and I didn't touch on it too much, support material. So again, if I was going to print this Iron Man standing up on the FDM printer, his arm actually comes down and then is hovering out here. So it's an impossible print. So what you need to do is create essentially a support base, material that just goes up and holds that, gives a support platform for that arm to start building out.
Yeah. If you've ever seen when people are building Spider-Man cowls and whatnot, it is this almost venomous spaghetti or arms that are sort of holding it in place as it's building upward and vertical.
So again, to be able to support something that's just in completely empty air there. Like the Benchy, like I said, has its 4 supports that kind of work little miracles with doing lines across. But this is an arm that's down lower from his shoulder. So there's nothing to support. Right. So that's where you're going to need those supports to come in and do that extra, no pun intended, but lifting work for you to maybe small pun intended, to get that to float there. So, that said, you could print this on the FDM printer, and if you were happy with how it came, print it in red, you're all right, that's done. I mean, throw it up on a shelf. I've got a Charizard up there if you want to pull it down. I've got a little Princess Peach. That it's like, I just printed that for kicks, and that's where it ended. Charizard here was covered in support material, but you see it came out really nice after the fact. But essentially, I completely lost my train of thought there.
You could just print it in here and be done.
So you could just print it over in the FDM and call it a day. But there's a lot of people, and I'm trying to get into this crowd, which is you're going to treat this, like I said, as a labor of love. You're going to really put a lot of time and effort into creating something that's essentially a really nice finished out statue that you can put up on a shelf and be proud of at the end of the day.
And you'll even see, I'm a collector of statues. A lot of designers now are modeling their statues in 3D and printing them, and then they're hand painting the 3D printed resin or PLA material. And you would never know that it's 3D printed. It's just unbelievable. You'd think it was sculpted by a master sculptor. And it's very interesting. I jokingly call it the mad scientist lab, but it really is a creative outlet for you to let you just use your imagination and bring that stuff to life.
Yeah, and you've heard throughout this that it's a very multi-part process. You have to have this model, which means you have to make a model or get a model. Mm-hmm. And for me, sometimes that starts with making that model. Yeah. It's been, I said, nice to come back after all these years where I haven't necessarily been dedicatedly working in 3D design spaces to pick up some software. And you can get, this stuff is so accessible now. Yeah. The two I'd recommend to anybody looking to start this right off the bat is something Fusion 360, which is made by Autodesk. It is almost more like CAD software. It's really meant for designing parts and pieces of mechanical type of things. But you can totally get away with making all sorts of things out of it. I make little drawers and toys for my daughter's calico critter sets. So she puts all her little dishes and stuff away in them.
I've seen people 3D print the drawer organizer for their forks and knives in the kitchen instead of going to Target and buying one for $15. And
one of the most printed sort of things you'll see on some of these Thingiverse websites are these like little modular organization systems that people have designed
for their desks and
exactly where you can just customize exactly how you want every little doodad on your desk to end up in a drawer.
It's wild.
But so then again, there's the items or on the flip side, you can kind of be creating more creative stuff, these statues. And I see a lot more people working in software like Blender, which is also a completely free piece of software. Each of them have certain limitations, but by and large, you can get by on doing amazing work on both of these without spending a dime.
Yeah.
I've only been more so recently getting back into Blender, and I've been using that for certain things you can't get done over in Fusion 360. But a lot of the things I've made so far have been done in Fusion. It's really fun learning that software. For somebody who's interested in that end of technology, it's fun learning the software, where everything is, how to best do certain things. And to that end, there's all these wonderful YouTube tutorials and stuff out there, again, totally for free in some cases, where people will walk you through, all right, we're going to make a basic box on day 1. And by day 30, we're going to be making this mechanical part that can twist and do all sorts of things. It has gears, and it's fantastic. Yeah. I mean, it's really cool that people with a passion for this hobby, or because you're seeing it's connecting a lot of dots. It's not just 3D printing. It's modeling, it's painting, it's all sorts of things coming into this one area. And I have my niche. Clearly, I'm working on superhero stuff and little doodad tools around the house. But there's other people that are creating all sorts of highly mechanical things.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
I
saw somebody 3D print like prosthetics for people who have lost limbs and stuff like that.
Well, so like that, I'm so glad you mentioned that. So I right now these days work at NJIT, and we are an awesome technical school, and they have this unbelievable maker space, thousands and thousands of square feet full of every kind of tool you could imagine. And so they have large 3D printing labs that the students have constant access to, and very often are required to create projects and work on there. And so it's really neat. I work as a photographer in my day job. When I go to these student fairs where they're out there showing the work that they've done, and they've printed a really cool modular hand for somebody who's lost an arm, or just different little quality of life things. There was one group that I was fascinated by where it goes back to almost old school sort of thinking with the old hook when you lost your hand. But they made all these different click on, click off attachments that had all sorts of different purposes that would help somebody during their daily work or whatever they were trying to do that are in that situation. And it's wonderful. And I've seen, and maybe I can even hopefully myself give back at some point this too, but I've seen a number of people online, especially for little kids who have lost an arm or have a deformity or whatever that comes along, people printing them Iron Man repulsor arms or stuff that is going to help them in their day-to-day, make them feel whole in their day-to-day, but also is going to give them that little kick. Like, I love Iron Man. I want to have his repulsor arm sort of thing. So it's really cool to see how people use those things out in the world to better other people's lives as well. And just swinging back to the university, they have several other printing technologies past what we talked about here today. They have this technology that I find completely mind-blowing and fascinating, and I really still need to learn how it works more, which is called sintering 3D printing, where essentially there's a big cube that you fill, for lack of a better descriptor, with what looks like dust or sand. It's like this gray particulate matter, and you tell it the part that you need, and you can give it a completely functioning part. You could create a bicycle where the wheels spin, the chains move, everything, and it creates it inside the sand by firing lasers through it. It's completely mind-bending how it works. But at the end, you dip your hand into the sand and pull out this completely finished part that was just made in space.
Wow.
And it's unreal how cool it is. They have a metal 3D printer. Which is, again, we're talking here today like small-scale consumer stuff, but there's people that are out there now starting to machine parts. With 3D printers.
For cars and aviation, all kinds of different stuff. It's unbelievable what they've been able to, in a short span of time, expand in this 3D space, which is kind of crazy.
I would say that this is a good lead-in to what I would sort of say is that I think 3D printing is going to become a household thing as much as your microwave is in the next 20 years.
We've seen, in movies a million times in the not too distant future where food was 3D printed and stuff like that. And you're, oh, come on. But I've seen it. I've seen people make pancakes with 3D printing technology.
I saw something where they printed meat somehow recently with it. It's I don't know that I want to eat it right now. I don't know if I want to eat it ever necessarily. We'll have to see how that goes. But traditionally, for the history of humankind, we've used more what's called subtractive manufacturing. If we want to make a table, we cut down a tree and we take certain selections of wood out of that tree and we bind it all together to make a table. If we're making something out of metal, we get a big piece of sheet metal and we cut the size of the part out and we get rid of the rest of it. And it's, in some cases, very wasteful because we're taking away parts that we can't necessarily use, and some of it just ends in the scrap heap. What I mean? And not to say that 3D printing is also without its messes. There's plenty of little extra plastic, which is, again, not the most wonderful thing for the environment. It's a whole other discussion, though. Microplastics has become a big talk and everything, so you have to be mindful of what you're doing with your materials, and especially with your resin. Going back to that quick, when I'm done with all that and I've got that dirty resin in the alcohol, I can't just pour that down the drain. It's toxic. So you have to go through a process of curing that and cleaning it out. So again, I probably scared a few people away from SL printing here today, and with due cause. It's definitely an uphill battle. But as we're progressing with this technology, the concept of additive manufacturing is becoming much more viable. This idea of, I have this plastic, it's on a spool, And then I can print out just what I need to make a new back to my remote control for the TV that I lost. Or I have just enough to make whatever that little thing is that you might be making. And the other thing that I'm sure a lot of people have seen stories on is now they're starting to make homes out of 3D prints. They have this concrete 3D printing technology.
It's a brick they made there, and it's unbelievable. They're just putting together Legos essentially.
Yeah, they're getting to a point now where they can essentially go out. It looks like a big crane, but it's a big 3D print arm, and they can print a whole house out of this material in 2 and 3 days. And there's been some stories of some of the earlier ones are not holding up so well. Like I said, this is new technology. We got to figure our way through it.
Yeah.
But this is also what they're planning for things like the moon and Mars.
Yeah.
If we go to colonize those locations, they're going to send a series of robots that can 3D print. They're going to 3D print HABs there.
A space station of some sort, yeah.
And they're already playing with that technology. They're
Yeah.
already working with this at places like NASA. So it's really something where right now it's a niche hobby that somebody like me who's got a couple extra bucks to burn can play around a weekend warrior style and make some little fun stuff for my kids or for my coworkers.
For himself mostly.
This past holiday season for all my people on my team at work, I made these cool little gift boxes that has a bow on top. And if you twirl the bow, it locks the lid off. So I put candy in and brought that to them. But then they kept it all year and they've used it for pen holders or just to put little stuff in. So I mean, what you can do with it is limitless.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You can really play around and create all sorts of fun little nonsense things or very helpful things.
Yeah.
You know, my older brother has a boat and it has a little door latch on it, and the piece that hold the door latched in broke. And he's like, do you have a way of recreating something like this? So I got some rough measurements for him, redid it in Fusion 360, sent it off to him. He had to do a little sanding to make it squeeze in, but now it's 2 years later and the part's still working.
Wow.
That's in a boat.
Yeah.
And if anything about boats out on the salt water, anything that's out there deteriorates. It's crazy. It's out in the sun all day. This part's still holding up with a metal latch hitting it day after day after day.
Wow.
So it's really cool what you can get done now with this sort of technology.
Dude, I am blown away. As always, I'm super impressed. And it's 3D printing is something that any hobby, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to do this. You can just do a little Charizard here and have fun with it. But you could really, people are making it into businesses. They're doing it for science and so on and so forth. And it really could expand your horizon on things. And if you're interested in this, you should definitely check it out. And printers are becoming very, very accessible. You can go to Amazon or Micro Center. You could buy a printer. I've seen as
I would even point you to Facebook Marketplace. I constantly see on Facebook Marketplace wonderful Ender printers, which is a perfect entry level printer to get in and start figuring your way around. The Bambu Lab printer that I use, a little bit more high end. I'm not going to suggest anybody necessarily for their first one just goes out and runs and buys that because it's a little bit more expensive. And if you got to figure out if this is something you want to do or not, but I'll see on Facebook Marketplace people giving away free
I've seen
Ender machines. Where it's, I saw somebody the other day, where my neighbor or my roommate moved out. He left this in the closet. I don't know if it's working or not. Come see if it's working. Now, given you hopefully want a working one, but I would bet dollars to donuts it probably isn't. Just got left behind.
Yeah.
But you can get some of these low-end 3D printers for pretty cheap.
I've seen them as low as $200 at times.
And I would also even point out, and this is a wonderful thing for anybody that's at a bare minimum interested in this and is afraid to take the leap into some bigger machine or some bigger time commitment, or if you have kids, this is the best thing in the world. 3D printing pens are so damn cool.
Oh, really?
So it's essentially, I'm going to hold up a Sharpie here and demo, but it looks like a pen, and you put the same type of filament through it. Zoe has one, and I give it to her. Zoe's my daughter, and I'll give her filament from mine, or she has a bunch that came with hers. And you sit there and you start on a little rubber base and you start moving it around and you press a little button and it extrudes the filament as you're pressing the button.
Wow.
Stops when you take your finger off, and you can start building little fun creatures and things, or little, whatever your mind can imagine. She'll draw her name and stick it up on the wall, like in the 3D, and it's cool. And people might use 3D pens to fill in gaps on some of these prints and things like that we're doing. So those are incredibly accessible. You can get those for super cheap off Amazon, off Micro Center, off. You can get that. I've seen them at places like Target. Yeah. And it's a great way to start playing around with this concept of, all right, I have to start at the bottom, I have to build. It has to go up. I mean, it has to have something to stick to. You can't just, if you start doing it in thin air, you're going to have a droop of stuff falling down. So it's been a fun way to start teaching Zoe about the basics of how the prints work and everything too. So, I mean, that's accessible to anybody right now.
That's awesome. Well, listen, again, thank you for letting me take over your lab for a second and interview you for 45 minutes now, but it was super cool. And we can sit here and talk all day, but I'm sure you guys have tons of questions and whatever. Feel free.
Or maybe you're getting ready to go 3D print.
This episode of So You Want to Be a Geek is brought to you by Comics Capsules. These are a great product for protecting your comics. They are UV resistant, crystal clear. They are stackable. They fit in your regular long and short boxes. They fully encapsulate your comics with a flip top hinge that allows you to access your comics anytime you want. They'll even fit with the bag and board in the sleeve. It is really, really cool. They have this great little eye hook. I have some hanging up back there. I have some over there on display. Because sometimes you just want to display your cool comics without having to send them out to CGC and waiting and spending a fortune on getting them graded. This stuff works great. I really, really love them. You can even have like a dedicated label inside of them. They're super awesome. So our sponsor for this episode of So You Want to Be a Geek is Comics Capsule. Do you like hot sauce? I know I do. Well, one of our sponsors for this week's episode is Jablo Hot Sauce. They are a family-owned, locally produced, amazing Filipino hot sauce that was recently featured on Hot Ones. You're gonna love it. You can put it on everything from hummus to meats to vegetables, whatever you think of. They are a great company, family owned and locally produced Filipino hot sauce. If you want to find out where the punch is, check out Jablo Hot Sauce.
Eddie, and I am here with one of my former students who is a 3D printing aficionado. This is Peter St. Amor. How are you, Peter?
I'm good.
Dude, I am so excited to have you here on the podcast and be a part of this sort of crazy world we are with fandoms and geekdom and stuff like that. And the thing about Peter that has always been very interesting to me is he can do so many different things, and whether it's 3D printing or film, and he has this whole world of 3D printing stuff that he creates, and I think the content is amazing and the work is really, really good, and I wanted to sort of talk to you about it. And the first question I have is, how did you get into wanting to even start 3D printing stuff?
Yeah, so it was actually kind of an accident. I've kind of been a maker for my whole life, mostly stuff out of cardboard, anything I could get my hands on, really. And I had some experience in engineering from robotics, but I really kind of put that part of me aside when I went into college because I wanted to do film. Mm-hmm. And part of film was like, I really wanted to open up my horizons by doing 3D visual effects. And I learned the software called Blender, and I took a couple years getting really like fluent in that. Mm-hmm. And I was looking around for jobs in that right as I was going into college, and I found a design job for a university that had some grad projects that needed like a dedicated 3D modeler for. So it was actually through film and not through the engineering or the making that I'd done. And then through that job, I got a second job working for a biomedical company and doing essentially just like research tools for their experiments. They need like very specific shapes where it doesn't necessarily have to be precision, but they need custom stuff. Mm. And with that job, they wanted me with the university. They had a print lab, so they were just taking my models and sending it to the print lab. With this job, they wanted me to handle the whole thing. So at first, I looked into like print on demand or like printing services where you send your 3D models, and it was a large thing, so it would have been like $400 or $500 to print this part. And what ended up happening is I looked at just 3D printers that were just big enough, because this is bigger than most 3D printers could handle. And I realized that I could buy the printer, print it, and still be several $100s under budget. And I could charge them and pay off the printer and also give them a lower price than I would otherwise. So that's what I ended up doing with that. So I'm actually really fortunate that the entire 3D printing hobby has not cost me anything. I've paid off everything that I bought for that hobby.
Really?
Which is a great feeling when it's a hobby. I'm sure you're like this with when it's like, these are tax write-offs. These are business expenses. I can spend as much money as I want as long as it helps me achieve this goal.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, for those who want to sort of step into this world of 3D printing, but there's so many different types of printers. Like, what's a good entry-level printer for somebody to get into? Like, I looked at things like the Bambu 1A or A1 or that. Like, it's something it's a multicolor printer. I mean, there's the Ender printers, which everyone likes say, don't buy those. You know?
I have a printer that's made by Creality, which is the same. It's essentially just a bigger version of the Ender 3.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really get why people don't say not to buy the Ender 3. I think it depends on how tech savvy you are and how comfortable you are taking things apart and fixing them.
And troubleshooting, right?
Yeah. So, again, I only have experience with 1 or 2 printers. I'm not really... I consider them a tool that I use. I don't consider myself a professional in 3D printing. So when it comes to like knowing all the different types, I will say, from what I've seen, kind of the Ender, there's kind of 2 main strategies in the 3D printing market right now.
There's PLA and then there's like resin. And
yeah, there's that. There's also it's FDM and resin, which is kind of the 2 hobby techniques.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to specifically FDM printing, there's kind of 2 schools of thought with the companies. The first is we're going to make things for the engineers, for the makers, for the people that are comfortable taking everything apart. I can take my entire 3D printer apart with an Allen key and put it back together. And that's a really awesome thing because it's easier to troubleshoot than a normal printer, which is ridiculous. But the second side of that is the other mindset, which is something that's much more recent because the technology is getting better, is we're going to make 3D printers for people that don't necessarily have an engineering background, that just want to print. I would group, so that's like the Bambu Lab stuff, the high-end printers. You're spending a lot more on those typically. I buy a lot of stuff secondhand, so I don't really deal with like new prices, but I'd rather buy something I can fix. That being said, I've heard a lot of great things about the Bambu. I think
it really depends on if you are willing to be a tinkerer versus somebody who is more like, I just want to go on Thingiverse, download something and print it to make a product out of it kind of thing.
And don't get me wrong, you can do that with the other things. I think a lot of the negativity towards the Ender line of printers is because they really haven't changed. They were kind of the first consumer printer that did a good job at a reasonable price. And since then, every single model is just essentially the same thing. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. Occasionally they'll add extra features, but I think it's really the lack of creativity and the lack of innovation with that specific line of printers is why people are going away to that now. And I think it's more of there are more things like the Bambu. I haven't heard anything bad about the Bambu line. They seem awesome.
You're going to pay for it, but like...
I don't think they're particularly out of reach.
I mean, I think...
One that I was looking at, sort of like an open box one with 4 spools outside, and I think you can get it for like $600 or $700. You get fully equipped. I mean, there's the other one that's fully enclosed. It's a little over $1,000 or whatever. But depending on what you're looking to do, there's a lot of different versatility, which I think kind of interesting. Like I started printing on things a while back using like a Makerbot. Yeah, like the Replicator 2 was
one of the first.
One of the first,
yeah.
And it was $3,000 for this thing, and it took 9 hours to print like a tiny little boat. It took forever. And I find that it's so amazing that things can print faster and you have a little more versatility on things. Do you mostly do like PLA stuff, or do you have a resin printer as well, or you?
I started out in my dorm. Not the best idea, but also if you like making stuff, and you have to choose one tool, you could do worse than a 3D printer. So I did a lot of research into what materials are toxic because I'm sleeping in the same room that this thing's running in. A lot of the older materials, a lot of the stuff that was like coming out right at the beginning, like ABS. ABS apparently has some not great fumes.
Yeah.
So I looked into it and I found there were like, specifically I was printing in PLA is it was actually PLA Plus, which they just add extra stuff in there. It was cheapest. PLA is great to work in because it's rigid, it's strong, it's just a good medium, and it took a little bit for the 3D printing market to find it, but once it did, it kind of took over, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
And then other than that, if I didn't need a specific thing, I just stuck with that and I just bought it in bulk. So I also printed in TPU, which is like a food grade. It's higher temperature, a little bit more difficult to work with, but the rigidity of the project at the end it's a bit tougher.
Okay.
And then the temperature is higher, so it's unlikely to warp in the heat versus I've had PLA, like I had printed a guitar / ukulele out of where the main sound box for it was PLA, and I took it on a canoe trip. And
like the moisture and
it wasn't the moisture because it's plastic, so the moisture doesn't bother it. But specifically, it was black plastic in the sun, and thermoplastics are designed to be soft at high temperatures. And it doesn't actually need to get that hot for it to slowly decrease in structural integrity. And it just like by the end, I had this like crescent shaped thing. So it's known to warp because it's supposed to be at the low temperature.
Right.
The only other material.
Notice like some
PLA material, like especially like a clear, over time will begin to yellow if you don't get good quality stuff over time. Sometimes.
Yeah, I haven't really had that.
I have some stuff that's kind of old. But
it's like the print. It looks yellow now. It's weird.
I had some. I think the only other material that I've printed in is TPU.
Okay.
Which is a fun one because it prints flexible.
Oh, that's cool.
It's a pain to work with though because how FDM printers work is just because you've some experience in 3D printing. It kind of pushes the spool through a hot end.
Right.
And if your final material is flexible, then your material going into that is flexible. So rather than pushing think of it as a piece of spaghetti. You can push a hard piece of spaghetti through whatever. But a soft piece of spaghetti, it just knots up. So it jams so much, and it had a lot of other problems. But it gives you that flexibility. And I printed a couple different things. The big thing that I printed that I was really happy about was stunt knives for a short film I was part of. Yeah, and it was like a just normal kitchen knife, and they needed an exact replica of an actual knife that they had. And I was able to do a hard version that had like a really nice gloss coat so that we wouldn't have a sharp knife on set. And then I was also able to do an exact replica of that was a flexible. And obviously the paint on that is different because you can't do like a foil coat. You need to do paint. So it's a scale of how good does this look versus how safe it is.
Right.
So depending on how fast it's moving, you can kind of switch through.
Yeah.
And it was good to be able to give the director and the coordinators and stuff that flexibility.
It's amazing that you can print a prop and make it versatile. Like back in the day, it's like go to a prop shop, but now you can, if you can envision it, I can figure out how to make it and make it something that's functional. And you have a handful of really cool little things here that I see. Is that like a lightsaber hilt?
Yes. So this is. Can I chuck it to you?
You can use the camera right there. It's right pretty, yeah.
Well, I want to have
sure?
you hold it. So that is a human-sized scale of the
Lego lightsaber. Yes, I've seen these in Lego stores that or places they sell this kind of a thing, and it's amazing. And now, did you model this, or did you?
Yes,
you did.
So I found a photo of just the side of a Lego lightsaber hilt. And it's just a really basic shape to model. Mm-hmm. There's not the geometry on that's really simple. It's rotationally symmetrical. It's just a ton of loops. Mm-hmm. If you look in the center of that's where the custom part comes in.
Oh.
So that is a channel that's designed for a 1/2-inch piece of PVC. Mm-hmm. Because I'm part of this group that does humans versus zombies games. We're using swords that are made out of pool noodles, and the handles, the internal core of those is PVC, so you can slide that over there, and then you have a Lego lightsaber.
And then you could theoretically put some sort of LED underneath and sort of power it if you wanted to, and give some sort of
exactly because it has that kind of hollow shape. It's a good prop.
That's cool.
But also, you can kind of build it out and customize it a little bit.
Make it and do whatever you want with it, which is really, really cool. I've seen people even do, especially with lightsabers, almost the sort of retractable thing where they can whip it out and just extend and everything. And this is amazing though. This is wild. I love it. Very, very cool. What do we see? You have almost like a Rubik's Cube over there.
Yeah. So I can't take credit for this design. This is kind of one of the standard Thingiverse first prints that a lot of people do.
Whoa.
Sorry.
That's okay.
If you don't want me throwing stuff around.
No, it's fine. I don't care. I just have bad catch. So this is, now, is this, did you have to put this together after you?
Yeah, so you can actually pull them apart. It prints each corner as a piece, and then there's interlocking pins. It's almost like working with Legos again. It's just and then there's a core in the center.
Yeah, and it's like a stress ball in a way. Like it's
Yeah.
sort of like one of those fidget spinner kind of a things. Or like, that's neat.
The thing I discovered on those is specifically with PLA. When I first printed that, it was kind of rigid and it would squeak. But as you start using it, PLA wears really nicely, especially if it's rubbing against other PLA, where if it's not an exact fit, especially if it's like a threaded part or a gear or a rotating axle, it will smooth itself down in like a way that makes it smooth but doesn't overdo it and wears through the thing.
Wow. I have seen people like take PLA and almost make like screws out of them for certain
Oh yeah, I
things.
have just throwing stuff at you. So that's a bolt that I made. It was kind of a test to see, can you get the tolerances right on threading? Because
it feels like a bolt. Like it feels like a real legit bolt. The threading is incredible. Like how it could be that small, and it's awesome. Like the cool thing about like the practical uses for stuff like this is just out of this world, and like it just, oh my goodness, I could fix a chair with this that I have broken in my house.
The structural integrity on that is pretty low.
It's probably not. It's not as strong as a metal bolt.
I have a second one that I've broken just by twisting it.
Oh really?
But I've seen it a lot in like joinery, where if you're 3D printing two pieces, like I was printing a Warhammer shovel for a friend, and it was made in like 6 different segments. It wasn't my own design. He had like purchased it from somewhere, and I was printing it for him. But it had these threads where the whole thing screwed together in just a really satisfying way. Again, it was for a LARP costume. People are really touchy with 3D printed Warhammer. It's one of the more controversial.
They're also really touchy about 3D printed like Roblox kind of things. Is those like swords that you see from Roblox that have the funny little cube shaped things. I've seen people like do those a lot at the cons, stuff like that. They have a lot of 3D printed stuff like that. Why are they funny about the Warhammer ones?
Specifically, there's a lot of like buying and selling Warhammer stuff online, and I was looking into forums because I'm looking for ways of branching out and creating new revenue. And there's a lot of forums and a lot of people that really don't like the copyright infringement aspect of it, because it's a miniature. It's a mini company. They make the miniatures. Right. They don't like it. Some companies are more or less friendly to people doing artistic representations of their stuff. The company that makes Warhammer, from my understanding, is not a big fan. And that's why I've kind of stayed away from it a little bit. Partially because of that, partially because I do FDM printing, which is not as good for minis. When it comes to like, it can be a little weird how things get controversial in 3D printing because it's such a positive hobby. And then occasionally you step on someone's shoe or on someone's toes, and a community kind of doesn't like it as much.
It's so, on the one hand, I get that point of view, but also it's like, if you want to create and like you're a fan of a certain thing, like that should almost be like almost like a sense of pride. Like, wow, they love this so much that they want to make a human version of this. Like it's just amazing, or all this stuff. It's just so wild. And is that the neck of a violin?
Yes. So this is kind of a project that's been in the works since last year. I found a file on making a full violin. It's electric. This is not by anywhere done, but there's 3 main parts, and there's a ton of cosmetic parts on the outside of it, which I have yet to print and sand and install. Plus, there's a whole lot of like electronics that I need to get for it. So it's kind of been on my shelf. But it's aside from I should have brought it, but it's one of my biggest projects aside from the Mandalorian helmets, because I designed and printed a couple Mandalorian helmets, which really? I think one of them is at home and I gave away one, but it was kind of another step in like how do I make 3D printing profitable.
The 3D printing of helmets and cowls and like Spider-Man masks.
that's awesome.
It's like big business now. People are making for cosplayers are making big money making like Wolverine masks or Spider-Man helmets or all that kind of stuff. And it's actually like a legit, people have business. There's a guy I follow on Instagram who's got like a room of like 10 3D printers and it's all just printing helmets in different pieces. And he adds the magnets for the eyes and all that kind of stuff. It's wild. And it's created an industry for an entrepreneur to make money, make content, and like, in a way, fulfill people's dreams. Like, wow, I could have a legit looking Mandalorian helmet that I could have somebody 3D print. It's just like, it blows my mind. It's wild. I love that stuff.
The economics of 3D printing is just so different from anything we've ever seen. Because traditionally, if you want to make something plastic, you need to
make a mold,
prototype, and then the molds on those are tens of thousands of dollars starting. If you have something that's complicated, it's more. And then those molds have a minimum purchase requirement, so you have to do like a whole run. There's a great YouTube channel called Slant 3D, and they're an industrial size print farm, so they do a lot of content on what is 3D printing bringing to the table that traditional manufacturing isn't. And one of the things it brings is incredibly small economics of scale. So you can become profitable after your first like 10th thing that you printed and sold, not your first 10,000. It's nice. It's because it was kind of used a lot. 3D printing is used a lot in prototyping.
Yeah.
And now with the rise of like major print farms and just the technology becoming more reliable, we're finally starting to see technology that it's kind of industrialized to the point where you can almost have a print on demand. There are print on demand services where if you send them a 3D model, they will allow you to link their sites just like you would print a t-shirt. And that's really, really amazing to see because it's a physical.
Yeah. There's a guy that I follow on YouTube who modeled a 3D printed like accessory to rig out a camera. And it's basically like a V-mount rig for a camera, but it's got all these other accessories. And you can go on the website and say, oh, I want to add this element, and he'll print all of it for you and ship it. And like, it's just amazing that it can all be done 3D printed. And because it's a resin or a PLA material, it's so much lighter than a metal material. And you're not carrying a huge rig of this like giant thing. And it does essentially the same thing. And it's really like, it's one of those things that as someone that loves, and you and I both love Lego, is like, it's kind of like adult Lego. You can whatever you can imagine, you can find a way to forge a bolt or an object and just make it and piece that thing together. And like making an electric violin, like that's wild. Like it's if you go back even 10 years ago, nobody would have even thought this was a thing, right? This was ever going to be a thing. And like you said, it's becoming more and more accessible to people. Now, one of the biggest things people run into is, okay, I printed something, but now like I got what's your sanding process or painting and all that kind of stuff? Like you have like a whole room of like different paints and sprays and stuff like that you do for something, like for the knife, you had to give it a color and stuff like that.
For the prop knives that I did, because they were close up on camera, there was a lot of sanding involved. But for that, it was pretty basic because the handle was the same color. I print a lot in black just because I like the texture. I like it's a nice universal color. Lately I've discovered that the black pigment that they put in is actually finer, so it will print better, which is something I didn't realize until like after I'd already chosen that. But it's just the how it works is they have like clear PLA and then they pour in like the pigmentation,
whatever the dye is, and
powders or whatever. Yeah. And apparently the granular size of those is just smaller, so it's easier on your printer, which I didn't realize. That was kind of a happy accident. Speaking of camera rigs, have you seen the CinePi?
No. What's
that? Arduino?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Okay. So the idea is open source hardware. One of the latest open source projects is an open source cinema level camera, where it has kind of the open source. The other side of that is a lot of people are 3D printing housings for it. So now you can get like entire cinema camera
3D printed,
8K raw, all that stuff.
Using Arduino as a
it's like a subset of Arduino. I think it might be Raspberry Pi. Yeah, it's Raspberry Pi now.
Because I have a couple of Raspberry Pis in my house, and my buddy, he has a million of them, and he's actually developing a product using both Raspberry Pi and Arduino software, and we're 3D printing the housings for this particular device, and it's really, really neat. And so we've like kind of got a couple different prototypes and experimented with. It's also like the screw heads. We had to have the right size of fit to fit through the Raspberry Pi. We're using like a Pi 5 or Pi 4 Plus, whatever it is, whatever the most latest version is. And it's super fun to just sort of experiment with what the housing should look like and how you can make it fit into a certain space and all that. It's just, and we used to have to like try to find something off the shelf, but now we can make a custom thing that looks a way we want it to look and has like a little sensor on it for a light, and we have the space for that. It's crazy. It's really neat stuff.
Well, it's another aspect of the open source community. What 3D printing did, like Raspberry Pi, they were big into like, you're making open source software, but we're going to make the thing that you can actually run the open source software on.
Yeah, like I have a retro Pi in my house that has all different arcade games.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
3D printing is open source physical stuff.
Yeah.
And I really like the overlap of communities that you get there.
Oh, big time, yeah.
Because it's really hard to pin down a specific group because it's just 3D printing stuff.
And there's a lot of like Reddit forums you could check out. And
yeah.
And it's just so much, like if you are a tinkerer, or if you are somebody that wants to experiment or just likes fun hobbies where you can bring your imagination to life, like a human-sized Lego lightsaber, you can do those sort of things with what is that?
I'm throwing more things at you.
Oh my goodness.
So this is a product that I
Is this for
kind of
SD
brainstormed.
It's like an SD card holder?
Yeah. So it's an SD card. It's Zippo inspired. It's a little smaller, but there's a magnet in there, so there's some fidgetability.
How did you get? First, you need to find a magnet that small to make that work, and then, dude, what's cool about this? I get the Zippo, but like even the feel of the way this feels, kind of like this grit to it. It's just kind of a nice feel to it. Like I like that a lot.
So this is one of the first things that I designed because there were specifically after I got the 3D printer.
Is even the little pin 3D printed too?
Yeah. So the pin is actually a piece of filament. So I designed, there's a lot of fun aspects to this. The first is I kind of designed the bottom part first, where you have a square and it's got beveled corners, and you have the two slots for the SD cards. And that was a really good way for me to learn tolerances, because when you 3D print and you need something to slide into something else, it can't just be the exact same size, because the 3D printer adds a little bit of width to the walls because it's not a perfect system. So I kind of learned how to do that, and then I learned the whole hinge system. And then kind of one of the final things was the hinge itself had it felt weird opening and closing it. And one of the things I discovered was this thing called fuzzy skin, where it takes the wall and it randomizes it, so you get that gravelly texture.
I love this. I have never. I wish I could. I've never felt anything like this before. It feels so. I mean, it's also like rock solid. Like it feels very strong too. It's the amount of layers in this tiny little thing is amazing, which is wild. And
so this is actually a texture that you can't get from traditional methods, because injection molding. I'm sure there's some ways of getting something similar to it, but for the most part, injection molding, you need flat faces for the piece to slide back out.
Right, but it's flat inside. Like it feels pretty looks like it's almost like very flat inside. It's not like it's going to grind against the SD card, right? Yeah, no, it's
just on the outside that it has that texture to it. And I was messing around with different methods for and different just tolerances, and then how does it rotate? How do the magnets work? How beefy does the hinge have to be? These really were kind of my final design for this version. I want to do another version with a much beefier hinge, because these hinges, the downside of 3D printing, one of the downsides is everything's on a layer. Right. It's not a solid piece of plastic. Yeah. So it's a little bit like working with wood, where if you're cutting across grain, it's not strong, but if you're with the grain, it is. And you have to just keep that in mind when designing. And one of the things that this does is with the hinge, there's a problem where the end of the hinge snaps because there's so little contact between the two.
Yeah. And over time, it could wear down, and the pin might break or something like that. Yeah.
So yeah, the pin's sorry, I didn't finish that part. It's a piece of filament that I put through and then melted both ends, like with a lighter. So it's almost like a plastic rivet. There are some of them that work really well, where like it's perfectly domed because the surface tension just pulled it in that direction. But yeah, these were a good experiment in product design.
Dude, I mean, this is a product here, man. Like, you could theoretically, like, you could also have a little flat circle here if you want to put somebody's logo in there.
Yeah, that was the next level, was redesign the hinge, which might be a ground up redesign. Because again, it's one of the first things I designed. It's an early project. So there's issues with the mesh dating back to the very beginning. And I want to make it like a little bigger. Like, this is actually smaller than a Zippo.
Yeah.
I built this before I actually had a Zippo.
But I think making it much bigger might be too big. Like,
oh no, so most of the ones that are out there are way too big, where they're like they'll store like 10 SD cards. But no one needs to store 10 SD cards. What you need is 2 SD cards.
Yeah.
I don't have more than 2 spare SD cards, and if you do have more than 2, you're not carrying them around. But these are great because they fit in your pocket. They keep your SD card from getting damaged. They are like somewhat drop proof.
The only thing I would probably, if you were to make it even a hair thicker, see if you could make room for a micro SD card.
Yeah.
Because like that, these 2 cameras are micro SD, and you'd have that extra spot for it. But like physically, like, I like the size of this. Like, this is like nice. It's weird, but it's amazing, and I think it's very cool.
I want to do a version 2 of this where I fix the problems with the hinge. I make it a little bigger. I'm not sure about adding a micro SD card because you can take the SD card adapter and you can put that in there.
You could, yes, that's
kind of a workaround, but the tolerances on a micro SD card are a little bit higher.
Yeah.
But I do want to do a version, something like that. And then I want to do kind of like a viral marketing campaign where I just run it over with stuff. Because the idea is like it's protecting your data.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. And I think there's a legit market for this because there is this sort of like fidgety sort of thing about it. And if you can make a version that's like this, but have a flat circle area where like you could print out a tiny sticker for a company's brand logo.
Because it's 3D printed and because it's literally a couple clicks, I can have the logo embedded in here on each one that's printed.
Yeah, it would be a great like giveaway for a company for like a holiday gift kind of a thing, for all that kind of stuff, or just like production companies. It would be such a cool, or even just photographers. Like there's so many functionalities to this. You could make money off of this. This is really cool.
All our film students here, they have to have SD cards, but they're bringing them to the camera, so there's just lost SD cards. So I gave a couple of these away to friends and such that they were editors, and the SD cards come out of the camera and then they're just kind of held.
Yeah.
And with the smaller versions, the risk of losing that is
breaking it. You sit down funny, or putting it next to your keys, or putting it next to your phone and have the magnet of it just fry it. Man, this is cool, dude. This is really neat. I mean, we could talk for hours. I swear, we could really go on and on. What you have other couple of gadgets there? It looks like
this is part of the violin. It goes here. It's just another kind of one of the aesthetic pieces. These are cool because the story behind them is interesting. I used to do Vex robotics competitions. It's an international competition.
It's
where
like
you're familiar with it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So essentially, it's sponsored by the people that are building that give out the kits. But part of that is because they're educational robotics kits.
Is it like FIRST? Were they like with the?
They used to be related to
Dean
FIRST.
came in with the Segway and everything. Yeah, 'cause I used to work for it.
They used to be FTC, and then FTC split ties with Vex 10 or 15 years ago. I don't quote me on it, but I actually have because my older siblings were part of it, the robotics team that I was on, I have shirts that still say FTC.
Oh, no kidding. That's funny. That's cool.
But yeah, it's because they're the company because they make educational stuff and it's educational for engineering, they have 3D models of all their parts.
Oh, no kidding.
Which means I can 3D print things like
gears and stuff like that?
Yeah, this is the smallest, and they're not designed to be 3D printed, but they're CAD files. So all the dimensions are accurate and the tolerances are a little bit off.
Yeah, that's okay.
But that's essentially exactly what they sell. And I just printed it because it was like
look at how small this thing is, but the functionality for it, for any, like, there's just so many practical uses for 3D printing that I don't even know if we fully even tapped into it yet. Like, I see people they have a desk drawer and they figure, okay, they take the dimensions of their desk drawer and they 3D print like where their scissors will go and exactly how, and they organize all this stuff. And it's just, it's endless. This right here in particular, this, like, I'm going to call it Rubik's Cube style object. If you can think it, you can make it.
I just love it. There's a lot of stuff out there too. So if you have a hobby that's like, specifically, I kind of narrowed it down to 3 categories. There's niche, there's expensive, and there's regulated.
Right.
So like niche is if you have a specific hobby that it's not big enough for major companies to really pay attention to, then that's going to have 3D printed stuff already out there on the market because other people have run into that issue, and you only need one other person to have designed something and put it up.
Yeah, and a lot of the people who design these things sell the STL files on their websites or wherever, and you can they've already made it. Like, what's cool about 3D printing is it's great for people like you who have an engineering mindset. But if you're me, who is just like, I want to make stuff, I can go and find it and purchase it for relatively cheap for the STL files and just print it and make it. And maybe I have it in black and I want to practice how to paint it and get like painting it red or whatever and all that kind of stuff. It's just, the possibilities are so endless, which I love. Dude, this has been so cool and so fun to talk to you. And like, as long as I've known you, I've always said you're just, the stuff you can come up with like this is just incredible. And I wish you all the luck in the world with all of your endeavors. But if you decide to like start marketing some of this stuff and making it in some sort of business, I think you've really got something, because not only do you understand it, but you have a real passion for it. And I think that's very special. And that's kind of what So You Want to Be a Geek is all about, is like, we have a passion for something, we're geeky about something, and we want to run with it. And I think you've sort of shed a nice light in the sense that, like, hey, anybody can do this. You don't need to spend $5,000 on a printer and buy 3D Studio Max. You can get Blender for free if you want to tinker around with how to make stuff. And
there's a software called Tinkercad.
Oh, Tinkercad's another one. Yeah, it's a really good one.
I don't use it personally because I just know Blender so well, but Tinkercad seems a lot more beginner friendly.
It is very beginner friendly. I've played around with both of them, and they are. And I was saying to a class earlier, like, I'm not really good in a 3-dimensional space, but like, I can still understand, like, okay, I had a like basic model of a shape or a square, or just even if you want to try and play with that stuff. I think that's really, really cool. And kudos, man. This is really, really, really cool. Do you have like any way people can check out some of the stuff you do? Is it on social media or anything like that, or anything?
I have a very small amount of stuff. Because a lot of my earlier work was corporate clients, I'm not able to publish that stuff. Right. So a lot of it's just small artistic stuff. Most of the mechanical stuff isn't on there, but most of my digital art and 3D printing stuff is at Thor, Son of Odin. I'm not sure how the spaces work out, but if you look up my name, Peter St. Amor, it should come up on Instagram. Also, I believe it's Peter St. Amor on ArtStation. I also have some 3D printed stuff.
You could even create like a Fiverr account and do 3D printing through there. People will pay money. Oh, you can make something for me, and they'll do it. Done it for other things, and I think that would be a really interesting market for you. And this is super cool. And like this Zippo thing is wild. Like the texture of this, it feels like a.
Do you want to keep that one?
No.
No, I need people to beta test them.
Are you sure?
Hold on to it. If it breaks, just send me a photo of how it broke.
No problem.
And if anyone asks where they are, you can put them or how you got it. You can put them in touch with me.
I will definitely
sort them out with them.
Dude, so again, thank you so much for being a part of this podcast, and I think that this was fantastic. For anybody who's interested, check us out on social media. You can find us at SYWTBAG on Instagram and TikTok, on YouTube, or So You Want to Be a Geek. And you can find us on all your favorite podcasting platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and so on and so forth. And until next time, stay geeky, everybody. Bye for now.
Well, that's our show today for So You Want to Be a Geek. Thank you so much to Peter Labrozzi and Peter St. Amor for being on this show and talking to us all about 3D printing. It was amazing. I was really blown away by the stuff they showed me, the stuff that they're talking about, the things that they're doing, and the industry as a whole. If you want to know more about 3D printing, Check us out. Check us out on socials. Reach out to me and I'll get connected with people that can help you out. And maybe you too can start your own 3D printing business or hobby.
And we'll see you next time on So You Want to Be a Geek. Thanks for tuning into this episode of So You Want to Be a Geek. We'd like to thank the Geekster Media Network. I'm Michael Canetti. I'm your host, producer, and editor. We hope you enjoyed the journey into geekdom as much as we did. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at SYWTBAG for updates, behind-the-scenes content, and more geeky goodness. Have a topic you'd like us to discuss or a guest you'd like to hear from? Let us know. So you want to be a geek at gmail.com and stay up to date and join the conversation. Until next time, keep embracing that inner geek and remember, the adventure never ends.
This has been a Geekster Media production.
Hey guys, are you geeky about Halloween? I mean, who isn't geeky about Halloween? This month, we're partnering with HalloweenCostumes.com. This Halloween, make sure you stay on trend with all the hottest and most popular Halloween costume ideas. HalloweenCostumes.com has brand new 2024 costumes based on your favorite pop culture, events, movies, characters, and everything this year. If you're looking for the latest, the newest, the freshest, the trendiest, and the funniest, then HalloweenCostumes.com is the place to check out. They have all the newest, exciting, and best Halloween costumes for 2024. From this year's movie characters, new takes on classic characters, they've got everything you'll need to make this Halloween the best ever. If you visit HalloweenCostumes.com, we think you're going to instantly find tons of fun costume ideas for 2024 for you and the entire family, and everyone else you might know. If you click the link in our show notes or at geekstermedia.com, you can instantly save 20% on any item in your cart. So head over to HalloweenCostumes.com and find your costume for 2024 and be the envy of everyone in your neighborhood. Stay geeky, everybody. Now back to the show. Hey geeks, if you know me, you know that I love hats. And I have been, since we started this podcast, researching a company to produce hats for the podcast that I really, really want to promote and endorse. And I found an amazing company based in Arizona called Branded Bills. And they made this awesome hat right here with a leather patch, which is so perfect. It's got this raised print. It's really, really cool. They have snapbacks. They've got trucker hats. They've got fitted hats. They've got all kinds of style. And they really cater to me. My sales reps were so nice and so helpful. They answered a million questions and they made these beautiful hats. I can't wait to order more. I absolutely love them. The quality of the material is impeccable. I can't believe it. I just wanted to take a moment to shout out Branded Bills. They are an amazing company. You should really check them out, especially if you have a podcast or a business or something where you want to give merch to people and promote your business. Branded Bills, man, this is the way to go. They have a great company. I strongly recommend them. Thank you again, Branded Bills. You guys are awesome.